So welcome everyone, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome all to a conversation with Roger Thurow, hosted by the Power of Nutrition. This is the first of a series of expert opinion webinars that the Power of Nutrition will be hosting over the next few months. Our goal is to bring together unique and expert voices in the nutrition space and beyond for their perspective on the challenges and opportunities in tackling undernutrition, especially now during the COVID-19 crisis, where we know that there are increasing challenges in supporting communities to access nutritious foods and also to access the health services that they rely on. For those of you who don't know much about the Power of Nutrition, we are a unique funding and partnerships platform committed to ending the cycle of undernutrition and building strong and prosperous communities through improved nutrition during that critical 1,000-day window from conception to a child's second birthday. And we are really focused on creating lasting partnerships with philanthropic foundations, with individuals, with bilateral governments, but also with companies to really think through how we can strengthen and significantly scale the interventions that we know work during that critical 1,000-day window for mother and child. We do this through our unique leverage platform, where we offer new investors in our programs at least a 4x match for all new funds committed through the Power of Nutrition. And since forming in 2015 with our partners, we have established 12 nutrition programs in Africa and Asia. We have enabled over 30 million mothers and children to access vital nutrition services, and we have mobilized $500 million for nutrition through our unique leverage platform. In these uncertain times, the Power of Nutrition is advocating for investment in nutrition and health system strengthening, and we believe it's more important now than ever. And we're working very closely with all of our partners to support those who are responding to COVID-19. And today we are really honored to be joined by Roger Thurow, who is a journalist and author, a senior fellow in global agriculture from the Chicago Council Global Affairs. And he's going to share with us an inspiring story and lead a discussion on the opportunity presented when we tackle undernutrition. So Roger is a really powerful advocate in this space, and a voice for tackling the social injustice of undernutrition. And we all know the figures: 144 million children stunted. But what Roger does really effectively is connects us to the human stories behind undernutrition, and does it with a huge amount of heart. And he also really uses his work to connect us with the very simple interventions that we know can prevent stunting. So a couple of housekeeping points before I hand over to Roger. All participants are set to listening mode, but you can join the conversation by submitting questions in the chat box at the bottom of the screen. Thank you to everyone who provided ahead of time some questions during registration. We'll address those at the end. And this webinar is being recorded for those of you who couldn't make it, so can share widely afterwards. And so now I will hand over to you, Roger.
Thank you very much, Mabel. I will move to share the screen. Let's see if we can do that. There we go. All right. So thank you, Mabel. Thank you very much for organizing this gathering. And thank you very much to Power of Nutrition for your leading role in the fight to end malnutrition and stunting. And hey, thanks to everyone for joining this discussion today. I know a lot of you are involved very intimately in this realm. So everyone, please keep up your excellent work to end poverty and hunger and malnutrition, wherever it may be. You know, this gathering is extremely timely as we see the coronavirus health crisis, this global pandemic, quickly become a food and hunger crisis in many parts of the world, including in the US. The World Food Program is warning us that another 265 million people may face acute food security because of the health, economic, and food supply, the food system consequences of COVID-19. Particularly devastating will be the impacts on children, for it is the childhood malnutrition and stunting, the malnutrition and the resulting stunting, that will carry the legacy of this pandemic far into the future. We hope to illustrate this impact today by taking a journey, a very human journey, through the young life of one boy in Ethiopia, Hargirso, who I have been following for the past 17 years since the famine of 2003. Ethiopia, 2003. It's the first hunger crisis, the first famine of the 21st century, of our grand new millennium. 14 million people were on the doorstep of starvation, surviving, if they're going to survive at all, on the food aid rushing into the country. Many of them are children. This is the story of one of them, and it's the story of us all. Hargirso is 5 years old. He's weighing just 27 pounds when his father, Tesfaye, a poor smallholder farmer, carries him to an emergency feeding tent. The tent is packed with dozens of children, clinging to life, cradled by their parents. These children are literally disappearing in the arms of their parents. We can see that Hargirso is manifestly malnourished. Swollen face from protein deficiency, his arms and legs too weak to stand. He's propped up between the legs of his dad, Tesfaye. And we can see, from with Tesfaye, how thin he is, his ribs, his collarbones, so prominent. What has happened to my son, he asked. What have I done to my child? The day before, I was in the office of the World Food Program, the United Nations agency coordinating the distribution of food aid. I was in their office in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia's capital. We were studying a large map of Ethiopia, surveying the hunger hotspots we would be visiting in the upcoming days, when one of the WFP officials gave me a piece of advice. Though to me, it sounded like a pretty ominous warning. Roger, he said, looking into the eyes of someone dying of hunger becomes a disease of the soul. For what you see is that nobody should have to die of hunger, especially not now, not at the dawn of the 21st century. A disease of the soul? Man, what's he talking about, I'm wondering. You know how to take precautions against possible physical disease. Get your yellow fever shot, malaria tablets. You're aware, on the lookout for any cholera outbreaks or meningitis outbreaks. But a disease of the soul. The next day, we drove down to one of the famine hotspots south of Addis. We drove up a corkscrew dirt road to the Baricha Plateau, to a big field, a vast field that would usually host a bustling market. But what we found instead was a vast warren of olive green emergency feeding tents that had been set up by the gathering humanitarian community. Each of these tents contained dozens upon dozens of starving children and their parents. We parted one of the flaps of one of the tents and stepped inside. And it was a scene of utter horror. Speechless, I didn't know what to say. I mean, what do I ask? I wandered through the tent, walked to the back of the tent, and there I found Tesfaye and Hargirso. And these eyes, their eyes, so lifeless, so empty, so surrendering. These were the first eyes of the starving that I looked into. Hargirso, I learned, was receiving emergency therapeutic feeding, and he was beginning to recover somewhat. But it was a very slow and difficult process. So much so that the doctors and nurses and humanitarian workers said that his shock was so severe, the malnutrition so profound, that they didn't know if he would survive. Now, as a foreign correspondent for the Wall Street Journal at the time, traveling from country to country and story to story, I would normally have left the tent that day, written my story, and moved on. What's next? But this time I couldn't move on. This is the story that stopped me cold, the story of hunger and malnutrition in the 21st century. How had we brought this medieval suffering with us into this grand new millennium after all the progress of past years? After I left the tent, my diseased soul kept stirring. What, I often wondered, became of Hargirso? Had he survived? So 5 years later, still with the Wall Street Journal, I was doing some reporting back in East Africa. I checked in with the World Food Program and asked, hey, might you still be active in that area? And if so, might they be able to contact Tesfaye? They checked. Yes, they got back to me. Tesfaye is still there. Great, I said, I'm on my way. Ethiopia, 2008. Hargeisa survived, hooray. But clearly, he isn't thriving. Now 10 years old, Hargeisa was physically stunted. Tesfaye worries that his son is also cognitively stunted. Hargeisa isn't in school. He isn't able for it, Tesfaye says. Hargeisa is small. He's sickly. Hargeisa's mother, Fikre, wonders how much her son was impacted by her own malnourishment at the time of his birth. Those first years were so difficult for us, she says. Yes, she says her pregnancy was so difficult. She was frequently ill, food was scarce. Hargeisa was born underweight, and the first years of his life were marked by constant food insecurity as the family descended into an annual hunger season between harvests. This period of profound deprivation, when food is rationed, meals shrink from 3 a day to 2 to 1 to none on some days. When the drought of 2002 hit, helping to trigger the famine, Hargeisa was the most vulnerable in the family. His father carries him to that tent. So it is in these early days, it is in the early years when good nutrition is most important, particularly the first 1,000 days. The time, as Mabel was describing, from when a mother first becomes pregnant to the second birthday of the child. The time when the foundation of a child's strong physical growth is established. The time for cognitive development. It's the time when the brain is growing most rapidly and expansively. It's a time for strengthening the immune system to ward off future disease. It's the most important time for individual human development, and then by extension, it's the most in time for the healthy and strong development of families, communities, societies, the entire world. It would become the topic of my next book. Propelled by my diseased soul in 2013, I set up to follow moms and children through the first 1,000 days in India, Uganda, Guatemala, and Chicago. My first reporting trip was to Uganda. On the way, I stopped by in Ethiopia to check in again on Hargeisa. Ethiopia, 2013. Hargeisa was now 15. We can see he's still clearly physically stunted. Tesfaye is no giant, so you can see how short he is. So I'm 6'4", and Hargeisa at that time he comes up to the bottom of my rib cage. But he's very excited. I'm in school, he proudly proclaims. School? I asked Tesfaye. Yes, he was persistent, Tesfaye says. So Hargeisa says, hey, the school is very nearby. It's just down a dirt pathway. Come and visit. So he runs off and we follow. We arrive at the school. The principal says, yes, Hargeisa, he's in school. He's in that classroom. He points the way to the classroom. First grade. They're just learning the alphabet. Today, the letter B, combined with the vowels, Bobby, Bibo, Boo. First grade, age 15. For the first time, he's writing in his notebook, struggling to put words together and read at age 15. He's twice the age of many of his classmates, but he looks like he fits in. Physical and cognitive stunting. Stunting, stunted. It's such an ugly word. Even the sound of it is blunt, harsh, rude, stunted, stunting. Its impact ripples across time and place, like when you throw a stone into a placid pond, and all those ripples form when the stone hits the surface of the water, spreading to the shore. The ripples of stunting spread also from the individual to the family, to the community, to the nation, to the entire world. It impacts us all. As the ripples of that 2003 hunger crisis spread, so does the awareness in Ethiopia the cumulative cost of childhood stunting and malnutrition. The Ethiopian government calculating that childhood malnutrition cost the economy 16% of GDP annually, 16%, makes reducing stunting a top national priority. We can see from this chart how it declines from about 58% or so in 2000 down to 37% or so in 2017. And throughout the world as well, stunting is on the decline as improving nutrition becomes a key development goal. But the gains are slowing in recent years. Still, more than 1 in every 5 children under the age of 5 in our world today is stunted in some manner. 1 in every 5. And it's not confined to childhood. For stunted children become stunted adults. Adults with lower education, with lower productivity in the workplace, with lower wages, with a higher propensity for chronic diseases later in life. It's a generational legacy with profound cost for all of us. So we see that a stunted child anywhere becomes a stunted child everywhere. The World Bank estimates that the cumulative impact of childhood malnutrition and stunting costs the global economy more than $3.5 trillion annually. That's trillion with a T. It's a cost in diminished education, lost productivity, and higher healthcare costs. These are huge numbers, but the greatest cost can't be measured. On the eve of the 3rd decade of the 21st century, the decade that the United Nations has declared the decade of nutrition, this decade, I returned to Ethiopia in December 2019, while we were still all able to travel around. I returned back up to the Baricha Plateau, Ethiopia 2019. Hargirsa is now 21. He's an adult. He's still in school, now the 4th grade. So 6 years have passed since my last visit. He's advanced 3 classes. That's one of the markers of stunted children. They repeat classes more often. They learn less when they're in the classroom. They drop out earlier. This class, this 4th grade class, has 60 plus students. And there's 4 4th grade classes in that school. So 60 plus students in this classroom where Hargirsa is, and about half of these students are 18 years old and above. A legacy from the 2003 famine and a stunted generation. I asked the students about their ambitions, what they would like to be. A girl in the back raises her hand. I'd like to be a nurse and help people, she says. How old are you? I'm 18, she says. A boy in the front stands up. I want to be a doctor, he says. Oh, how old are you? 18 also, he says. Another boy in the back raises his hand. I'd like to be an engineer and build things. Hey, that's great. How old are you? 15, he says. Hargirsa says he'd like to be a doctor, also to help people. Or a businessman, or a teacher. This day, he is learning simple math at age 21. Simple addition, simple multiplication. It is highly unlikely that any of the children, that any of the dreams in this classroom will be realized. Stunted children, stunted aspirations. Stunting, you see, is a life sentence of underachievement. What might a child have accomplished for all of us were he or she not stunted? Imagine the lost opportunities. A poem not written, a song not sung, a novel not imagined, a mystery not solved, a horizon not explored, an idea not formed, an inspiration not shared, an innovation not nurtured, a cure not discovered. A lost chance of greatness for one child is a lost chance of greatness for us all. Why do we tolerate this? Ending stunting stands as one of our greatest and most achievable challenges. The United Nations, as I said, has declared the 2020s to be the decade of nutrition, urging dramatic increases in nutrition investments if the Sustainable Development Goals are to be met. It's time to raise the clamor, to create the give a damn. Now I look into these eyes of Hargeisa, and wonder, all these children aspiring to be doctors, nurses, professionals, might they be the ones to find a vaccine for COVID-19, to lead the charge against pandemics yet to come? If not, for being stunted, for being malnourished in their childhood, if not for their stunted ambitions. A lost chance of greatness for one is a cost too great for us all to bear. Thank you very much. Back to Mabel. Thank you.
Roger, thank you so much for that incredibly powerful presentation and for sharing Hargeisa's story. Thank you. I now want to hand over to my colleague from Power of Nutrition, Jeffrey O'Malley, who's the Associate Director in our investments team. Jeff is going to talk us through our program in Ethiopia. Jeff has an extensive background in public health, including working at the Clinton Health Access Initiative and Elmer Philanthropies on programs tackling a number of public health challenges such as HIV, TB, and nutrition. And Jeff leads our work in Ethiopia. So over to you, Jeff.
Thank you so much, Mabel, for the introduction, and thank you so much, Roger, for that story of Hargeisa, which basically shows the huge impact that undernutrition has on economic opportunities and education as well. So I just wanted to briefly walk you through one of our programs in Ethiopia, where we are supporting the government of Ethiopia integrate nutrition within its health system. But to start with, I think it will be very important for me to sort of walk you through some of the work, just a moment, walk you through the scale of undernutrition in Ethiopia. Currently, there is an estimated 13 million children under the age of 5 in Ethiopia. And the prevalence of stunting in Ethiopia is currently 37% in this population, which translates to about 4.8 million children that are currently stunted. But Roger already mentioned about the impact of stunting on economic opportunities, but I think it's also important for us to consider the contribution of undernutrition to child mortality. Because currently, there are 55 deaths in under 5 children out of every 1,000 live births. And almost half of these could be associated with undernutrition. But more importantly, for us to break the cycle of undernutrition, we also have to seriously consider maternal nutrition. And Ethiopia has a high prevalence of anemia, whereby 24% of all women and of reproductive age are currently anemic. And at the moment, there is an estimated 3.1 million live births in Ethiopia. And assuming that for every one of these births, there's one woman, that's a really, really high number that we'll have to consider in terms of maternal nutrition and women that require to access high impact nutrition interventions. So for us to address this problem of undernutrition, the Power of Nutrition and our implementing partner in Ethiopia, the World Bank, have been supporting the government to strengthen the health system with 2 key goals. The first is to increase the access to maternal and child health services, but also scale up and institutionalize high impact interventions within the health system. And the approach that we have with a lot of our interventions or programs across different countries, but also specific in Ethiopia, is that first, we align funding partners, implementing partners, and also put together financial resources, all behind government-led policy and strategies. By doing so, we're able to develop large-scale programs that we hope will achieve the impact that we require at scale. Secondly, we embed all these high intervention programs within health systems. The reason we do this is to build the capacity of these governments to both plan, implement, and collectively monitor these high impact interventions and programs, which normally, or over the past decades or so, these programs would normally be implemented by NGOs or other development partners, and thereby not developing the sustainability that we require. Specific to this intervention or to this program in Ethiopia, the mechanism that we're using is result-based financing, whereby we have pre-agreed targets that the government will have to reach for them to access the funding that we currently bring to the table. In terms of the health system strengthening interventions or approach that we have in Ethiopia at the moment, our focus is first to strengthen the capacity of healthcare workers to first deliver quality maternal and child health services, but also nutrition services. We also work on strengthening the procurement and supply chain systems so that health commodities and nutrition commodities could be available even at the lowest places for service delivery. But we also strengthen the monitoring and evaluation systems of the government to enable that, to ensure that we produce quality data that can inform both program implementation and course correction, but more importantly, also inform strategy. We do also realize that nutrition is very much complex, and for us to make a dent or accelerate the reduction of stunting, there is need for multi-sectoral coordination whereby different sectors such as agriculture, health, water, and sanitation all can get aligned behind government priorities. So that's a key sort of component or element of our work. An example, some of the interventions that we currently implement in Ethiopia, they include vitamin and iron and folic acid supplementation, growth monitoring and promotion, but more importantly, infant and young child feeding education or counseling, so that we can trigger the behavior change among women and caregivers. So I just wanted to give you a snapshot of some of the results that we've had from the program that we've been our implementing partner in Ethiopia, the World Bank has been implementing in Ethiopia. So first, over the last 2 to 3 years, we've seen a commendable increase in the coverage of maternal and child health indicators. As you can see there, one of the key indicators is the proportion of women that actually attend at least 4 antenatal care visits, or proportion of women that at least give birth in facilities. We do see these opportunities as being critical because they have touch points whereby we can not only provide maternal services, but also nutrition interventions. To date, we have roughly about 13 million children and 6 million women that we've been able to reach with critical vital nutrition interventions. And a good example is the intervention called iron and folic acid, which is provided to enable these women to improve in terms of, or to reduce anemia in women. Currently, about 60% of women that are pregnant in Ethiopia are able to access any iron and folic acid. Another good achievement is on growth monitoring and promotion, whereby just over 40% of women with children between the age of 0 to 23 are currently able to participate in growth monitoring and promotion. And this is a critical touch point for these women because this is normally provided at the community level. And what's also encouraging in Ethiopia is that currently the provision of vitamin A supplementation is being done through routine services. Previously, this intervention was being done once or twice a year through campaigns that were normally implemented by development partners or NGO. But over the last couple of years, we've been supporting the government to strengthen their capacity to routinely deliver this service, which I think is very much critical. So since we started the program in 2017, which is still very new, the reduction, the prevalence of stunting has now reduced from 38% to 37%. Though that might seem not a huge addition, it's because for us to clearly see the impact of the work that's been done over the next 5 years, that will probably be able to be seen within the next 4 to 5 years. So there is still more time for us to implement the current or to maintain the current coverage of interventions so that we can start seeing those gains within the next 4 to 5 years. I quickly wanted to go through some of the lessons that we've learned in this journey of implementing this program with the World Bank and the government of Ethiopia and some of our funders within Ethiopia. So I think the key learning point is that the focus on health system strengthening and maternal and child health is very critical for us to achieve any increments or increase in coverage for nutrition interventions. Secondly, though we are seeing some improvement in the coverage of this critical nutrition intervention, it's very much important for us to focus on behavior change. And this comes because women, though these services might be available in health facilities or at the facility level, if women do not really understand the benefits of these services and why they need to access these services, it's really, really difficult for us to see the effectiveness of the interventions that we are currently rolling out. The third learning that we have from our work in Ethiopia is when you look at the data at the national level, the country is making really good progress. But there are certain regions or woredas or districts within the country that are either stagnant or are even regressing. So it's very important for us to continue learning and identifying what's actually working, those good practices that we can translate into those regions or districts that are underperforming. By doing that, we'll be able to accelerate the reduction of stunting, but also increasing the coverage of these high impact nutrition interventions. And lastly, for us to achieve the World Health Assembly targets of 2030, it's really important for us to maintain either the current achievements or even increase what we are currently doing. Because as I've mentioned earlier, so for us to reduce stunting and undernutrition, it's a long-term gain. And traditionally, a lot of the funding that's been providing and a lot of the support is looking at short-term gain. So there is that need for us to continue supporting this country, but also building the capacity of these countries that will enable us over the long term to achieve the World Health Assembly 2030 target. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll now pass this over to my colleague Mabel to continue with the webinar.
Thank you so much for that. That was a really excellent presentation, insight into our program in Ethiopia. And before we turn over to the Q&A, there are some really excellent questions coming in, so please do keep those coming through. But before we start, I just wanted to hand over to our CEO, Martin Short. Martin was the first employee of the Power of Nutrition in 2015, after a career in the financial services industry, including 16 years at UBS Bank in Europe and Asia, and as the Managing Director of Lionheads Global Partners. So handing over now to Martin to share some closing remarks ahead of the Q&A.
Well, great, Mabel, and thank you so much, Roger and Jeffrey. I mean, Roger, a very personal story of one individual and one of many, sadly, hundreds of millions of adults now in the world that are stunted. And I don't know what the stunted population in the adult workforce is, but it's probably between 200 and 300 million in Africa alone. And so the impact on the economy, I think, is well understood. For those of you who don't know, there's less than 1% of global aid that is delivered into nutrition for nutrition spending, and that is presumably going to drop over the course of the next 18 months due to the lack of money available due to the COVID-19 response. And we can see the difference between some of these issues that we have in regards to stunting, which is all driven by fear. The response to COVID, it's contagious and it's coming to a town near you. And undernutrition, thank goodness, is not contagious. And yet the impact on society and on the economy is equally as devastating as that of a pandemic. Roger's mentioned, and I think Jeffrey's mentioned as well, this is all about economic opportunity as opposed to solely a moral imperative. This is about the IQ of an individual, of a community, and the capacity of a country. And if you can think that of those many millions of dollars that are lost per annum simply because the country doesn't have the necessary bandwidth, that grey matter involved in its workforce, that percolates through to a dampened GDP, which has its impacts across national budgets and how much money can be spent on education, how much money can be spent on agriculture, on the health systems, etc. And I think we're in great danger, of course, with the COVID response to actually go very siloed in this, and therefore we're pushing very much for a broader approach to the COVID response that includes the undernutrition, because what I do not want to see, which I fear may well see, is that the impact of COVID in the global south may not be as great as it is in the global north, and yet we're still going to have an increased numbers of people who are going to be stunted in the future, who are going to die from pneumonia because of the unintended consequences of the COVID response. To put some sort of granularity around that, 1.4 million children under 5 die every year from pneumonia. And I think that the COVID issue, I think, has brought some of these numbers to light. We sort of take this for granted in a way, or because it's somebody else's problem, we don't think that it is part of our infrastructure to deal with that. And that's, I think, something that I think COVID has now brought to the fore about what happens to people way beyond the borders of the UK and Europe. And secondarily, 50% of those 1.4 million had an underlying undernutrition complexity to them. So that made them weaker in of itself. So getting nutrition right is a real option and a real a possibility to ensure that your dollars just go further in education, go further in all other areas that you're particularly focused on. Because stunting is a social injustice that hides in plain sight. And you can see this, this boy, Hagiso, is suffering from is paying the penalty for a crime that he never committed. And that'll be with him forever. And sadly, and it's true, and I want to say it out loud and clear, he will never be a doctor. He will never be a businessman. He will never be a teacher. And he is consigned to a particular type of workforce, a particular type of activity, which is probably going to be around subsistence farming or something of a manual labor perspective, and will always be open to a low cognitive development and be open to non-communicable diseases. So part of this, the response to this is all about partnership and collaboration, two words that are easily spoken about and not yet delivered particularly well, because it's always very difficult to deal with partnerships when we're dealing that interface between public and private interfaces. And that question, I'm sure, will come up in some of the Q&As in a minute. The question that is all about domestic resource mobilization. There isn't enough money in development to solve all these issues. That's got to come with engagement with the private sector, and that's got to come with us and others promoting recipient countries that have high levels of stunting to give more of their national assets towards nutrition, and therefore to invest in human capital with the same modality and the same infrastructure as one would think through investing in infrastructure projects, in dams, in roads and railways. So I wanted to end there and pass it back to Mabel, but thank you again, Roger, and thank you again, Jeffrey, for a really excellent summary of you, Jeffrey, particularly with what we're doing and the work we're doing in one of our 14 countries that the Power of Nutrition are involved in, and Jeffrey for giving that incredibly human story that tracks this individual over so many years, that we can see that stunting is something that is real, that is tangible, and it is facing us and the reality of that in the world today. So back to you, Mabel, and thank you.
Fantastic, Martin. Thanks so much. There are some really excellent questions coming in, but I just wanted to start off with a question to Roger from Nicole. What do you think the biggest contribution the private sector can make, Roger? And then I'll open that up to Martin and Jeff as well.
The biggest contribution the private sector can make is basically acknowledging and embracing its responsibility and its role in ending malnutrition, hunger, stunting, the result of it, wherever it may be. I also saw one of the other questions was kind of what's the business case for the private sector? I mean, the business case is these are all your potential customers and consumers. They're your workers, they're your labor force. And so as we see, and Martin referred to it, and Jeffrey, just the lower productivity, the lower education level of stunted children that again become stunted adults. And so it is in the private sector's own interest and self-interest to be involved, because yeah, it's their workforce, it's their consumer base in the future. And who doesn't want all people to be as prosperous as possible? And you look at the impact on the economy. So, you know, say 16% in Ethiopia, it's $3.5 trillion worldwide. But in between, there's all these ripples. So there's impacts on, you know, the community development and just the lesser productivity of the labor force. Who's going to invest in those areas? And when you look at the cost, I mean, huge regions of the world that are driving global growth and the global economy in recent years, sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, where India is, the calculations there are that those great regions of the world that are driving the global economy, they lose on average about 11% of GDP, of economic activity every year because of the cumulative impact of childhood stunting and malnutrition. How much greater of an engine can they be for the global growth, for the growth of all of us, for the markets, for the businesses and the private sector, if we finally end and eliminate hunger and malnutrition? So if the private sector is really, you know, creative and they're thinking, well, what can we do? What's their role? Clear the food industry and anybody involved in the global food chain and their role, but also the private sector role in influencing and in shaping the food system for the betterment and the health of the consumers. So by prioritizing nutrition and more nutritious projects, by looking at the cost structure and making more nutritious foods cheaper. So a lot of things the private sector can do. Thank you.
Great. And Martin, I wondered if I could just turn that question over to you.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a debate since long before I joined the Power Nutrition 5 years ago, the role of the private sector in development, and there's still some people, I think, in the woolly, backdated 1980s who think there's no role for the private sector, and I think that is a particularly aged response. I think the private sector has got a significant amount of value to add that has made, I think, that representation been made well by Roger on this. But the private sector also is beyond the food sector. There are only 34 companies in the FTSE 500 that are in the food and beverage business. There are 466 other ones that have got nothing to do with the food business, and yet we do tend to think it's only a food private sector issue. It goes much wider than that. And as Roger said, these are all about future workers and future customers. And if we look at one of the interventions that the Power Nutrition supports and funds, which is hand washing with soap, behavior change communication, we've got a partnership with Unilever. Hand washing with soap, I would love to be able to say in a couple of years' time that the Power Nutrition no longer promotes hand washing with soap, because that's been outsourced and taken over by Unilever, who, no matter how much money I throw at that particular behavior change, I will never make it an aspirational activity, and I will never make soap an aspirational product to buy. That is the domain of the private sector. And what we have to do in development, I think, is embrace a very different type of engagement with private sector that is not just orientated around cash. Those days are gone where they're just going to give you cash. But I think the days are here where we've seen through the COVID response willingness from the private sector to be engaged in a much greater capacity. And we've got to utilize their value chains and supply chains and utilize their expertise about building markets and developing systems. Because if there is a country that has got a good legal infrastructure, that enabling environment, the private sector will go there and create jobs. And that is the domain of the private sector, to create jobs. It isn't the domain of governments to do so.
Fantastic, Martin, thank you. I have a question. I have two questions I'm going to kind of roll into one. Well, how can we ensure that long-term and sustainable results are achieved in nutrition? And sort of in tandem with that, why focus on the first 1,000 days? So how do we get, really that lasting impact in nutrition? If I could invite you, Roger, to start, and then I'll hand over to Jeff.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for the questions. The 1,000 days, I think what we've come to realize is how critical and important this time period is. There's so many, just in terms of the cognitive development, there are so many things that are already going on while the child is in the womb and developing, that are influenced by the nutritional intake of the mother for the development of these executive functions of the brain that we rely on, for almost every second of the day, for our reaction, for things around us, for communication, for understanding, for analyzing. our world and our problem solving. So this period, and as I said, it's the most important period for individual human development, but by extension then the most important for laying the foundation for for healthy families, communities, countries, the world as a whole. And nutrition is so profoundly important in that period because it drives in a lot of the physical growth and the cognitive development, and for long-lasting effects. So that then sets the foundation of hopefully that in itself working in that 1,000-day period. And of course, it doesn't stop with 1,000 days when a child is 2 years old. It continues. So that is then keeping the eye on this issue, prioritizing nutrition, recognizing that it's the cornerstone of all development issues, be it education, health matters, the water sanitation and hygiene issues, the infrastructure issues. The nutritional health of the individuals in our world is the cornerstone of all these development issues. That will hopefully carry it into the future.
Fantastic. And Jeff, if I could ask you to just reflect on that, how do we get longevity in our impacts in nutrition and the first 1,000 days?
Yes, I think there's a couple of things for us to ensure that there is sustainability in terms of the nutrition interventions. I think first is this aspect of aligning behind government strategies, because it's really, really difficult for governments to get involved in projects whereby they do not have any lead or any say. And this has mostly been the tradition whereby you see either private sector or corporate sector foundations funding a lot of nutrition interventions in isolation. So I think getting government on board and aligning whatever we're trying to do behind government strategies not only enables us to pull the funding together, but more importantly, puts the government in the lead. And where governments are able to see gaps, they would be more willing to even allocate their own resources towards nutrition. Secondly, I think it's this thinking of changing mindsets. I think traditionally, especially with the private sector and development sector, we've always been thinking of having quick gains in terms of nutrition. But us reducing stunting or undernutrition cannot happen within a year or two. So we should always be thinking within the long-term gain, either 5, 10, 15 years term. Sort of say, what structures or platform do we have to put, or foundations do we have to put in place for us to achieve long-term sustainability? And I think some of the approaches around that is through the coordination and multi-sectoral coordination, strengthening those systems, but more importantly, strengthening the health systems. And because if health systems are more resilient to certain shocks, but also there is increased healthcare worker capacity, or ministries of health have got their own capacity to plan, implement, and monitor nutrition programs. I think over the long term, we'll be able to build that capacity within the ministries or governments so that they can take on the implementation and planning of these nutrition programs. So I think those are the sort of 3 key areas that I think we need to focus on for us to sort of build sustainable nutrition programs over the long term.
Fantastic, thank you, Jeff. There are a few different questions about partnerships coming through. So partnerships with the private sector, how we partner with others in the nutrition space, and how kind of the nutrition community and the NGO community, as well as the funding community, is really coordinating their efforts. I don't know, Roger, if you could perhaps start us off by talking about your observations, and then if I could hand over to Martin to speak through how Power of Nutrition looks to partner.
Yeah, I think the partnerships are really important, and what we're learning, and I think both Martin and Jeffrey were mentioning this, what the pandemic and the COVID-19 is showing us, that look, it's not only, it's yes, the primary focus on that front is on the health side and strengthening health systems, but at the same time, the strengthening of the food systems and the nutrition system, and prioritizing nutrition is so important, because if bodies are healthier, if their food is more nutritious and they're looking, and caring for that, that then helps kind of ward off the diseases and makes one less susceptible for that, hopefully. So it's not just one stream, but you got to look at the wider field. And this comes across so profoundly to me as a reporter in the first 1,000 days, a book and the reporting for that, where I was following these families, moms and children and the families through the 1,000-day period. in India, Uganda, Guatemala, and Chicago. And it's something, it is something that is profoundly simple, but it's kind of revolutionary in play and in practice, that we have to deal with all these things at the same time, that just focusing on agriculture and providing more nutritious food, or focusing on the nutrition aspect. That's great, but we also have to realize, oh, those efforts can be so easily undermined by a faltering healthcare system and health system that we're seeing. It can be undermined by poor water sanitation and hygiene. You want the nutrients in the body, but they have to stay there, not that, you know, through illness of poor water, dysentery, diarrhea, all that then rushes and flows out of the body again. So the whole notion and the era of looking at these issues in silos, and for all these organizations doing tremendous work and being the best in what it is that they do, but realizing, oh, I need all these other organizations and these partnerships to form, because for me to be as successful as I am, as I want to be, on the health front, on the nutrition front, on the agriculture front, on the education front, I need to support and success and progress of all these other programs as well. Because as moms know, and I heard this so often and saw it, everything comes at you at once, including in our lives. So why we focus on one specific thing is kind of beyond me. And I'm a layperson coming to this. I'm just a journalist, but looking at it, it's like, no, everything needs to come together. So let's bust the silos, bust kind of the one mind, you know, the one track thinking, and that these partnerships then are so profoundly important.
Martin, bust the silos. Can you reflect on that?
Yeah, those old egos and silos. Yeah, I mean, I'm afraid that they still persist, and they will persist. I mean, the Paranutrition, for those of you who don't know, you know, is an organization that does not implement. And we made a very distinct decision not to do that. So we're a platform that convenes partnerships and collaborations, and then deals with existing infrastructures that are already on the ground, and try to assist them rather than compete with them, because there's no point us trying to do something that Nutrition International is already doing, or the World Bank is doing with governments, etc. Secondarily, we do operate at a level which is with and through government and government systems. And because of the size of the programs that we tend to do, which is at least $10 million and up to in excess of $100 million, you can't really use that money effectively in a country unless you're coordinating with that national nutrition program and incentivizing governments to utilize their own money. Also, I would say, listen, you know, partnerships and collaboration are very difficult to do. And if they were very easy, then we would all be doing them. But they aren't easy. And if you look at all of our programs, they have a minimum of 4 and up to 6 or sometimes even 7 different counterparties. So what we've tried to do is, and a phrase that we use quite often, is defragment the marketplace. So after doing that donor mapping, we try to gather people around, whether it be a US foundation, whether it be a European corporate, whether it be high net worth individuals in Southeast Asia. And we try to gather those around to one single program under which we all try to think through the best way to roll out those nutrition interventions. Because frankly, what does go on, which can be a bit frustrating, is that there are a lot of what I call romantic projects going on, which never get to the sight of government, and therefore will not be supported by governments after those individuals or those institutions leave the platform. They won't be taken up. Those monetary obligations won't be taken up. So, you know, if we join in with people like the Power of Nutrition, and indeed we're not the only people, and others, you know, our partnerships with UNICEF, partnership with Save the Children, World Vision, Care Gain, and others, I mean, I think incredibly important for us to be able to provide that defragmentation service, and then focus it with and aligned with the governments that are best suited to show us what they think is important to them.
Thanks, Martin. I'm aware that we've only got a few more minutes left, but I wanted to obviously turn to the current crisis that we are all facing with the impact of the coronavirus. And just to really ask the question, you know, will we see a backsliding in all the progress we've made in nutrition? firstly, but also we really feel there is a coming hunger and food insecurity crisis in a number of countries where the power of nutrition works, but far beyond. What can we do to mitigate this? And, you know, Roger, over to you first to really reflect on the unique times we are meeting in today.
Home, and I think a lot of people were surprised, particularly in the United States, how quickly, how swiftly the coronavirus crisis quickly became a food crisis, a hunger crisis. What we've been seeing in the United States is the long lines, incredibly long lines at the food banks. The rush in the grocery stores to, you know, clear the shelves of food to make sure that, you know, people had enough at home. The worry about, well, what happens now to the children, the school children who are, you know, receiving the free or reduced price breakfast and lunch programs in the U.S. schools. The schools are closed. Kind of what happens to them and the scramble for that. So that has all really brought the hunger that is, you know, it's always there. I mean, those lines are always there at the food banks. The demand for to fill the shelves of the food banks and the pantries is always there. The registrations and demand for the school feeding programs and the school meal programs is always there and increasing. So that's kind of this, you know, American oxymoron that we're now finding, hungry Americans. You know, that so, and then realizing that, boy, if this hunger, if as it moves into Africa and India, where one would think, well, if there's going to be a hunger crisis that comes from this, it would be in those places. My goodness, and kind of the what's coming out of the World Food Program and their estimates, yeah, that makes it imperative for all of us to make sure that this is dealt with as a food crisis, a food system crisis, a food supply chain crisis, a hunger and malnutrition crisis, in addition to this very grave health crisis that we have.
Thank you, Roger. Well, the Power of Nutrition is working alongside our partners to think how we can support scaling up the coronavirus response, particularly with the interventions that we already support and in a number of countries where we are already working. I'm aware that we've really only got about 1 minute left now. So just to say a huge thank you to everyone for joining us today. It's been a really excellent session. Huge thanks to Jeff and to Martin, and especially thanks to you, Roger, for sharing such a fantastic presentation with us, and incredibly thought-provoking and moving. We will be carrying on this conversation on our social media platforms, so please feel free to tweet to us, to send through any questions that you have to us on Twitter or on LinkedIn. And also, just to say, this webinar has been recorded, so we will also share the recording for those who couldn't join us today. And thank you all so much for a really excellent session, and really thank you to Roger.
Thank you.